Summer of 1944. Normandy, France. The air above the shattered road near Saint-Lô tasted like cordite and copper. Staff Sergeant William Doc Rasmussen knelt in a ditch thick with mud and something darker, his hands already moving before his mind caught up with what he was seeing. The boy, because that's what he was, couldn't have been more than 19, lay twisted among the brambles, his Feldgrau uniform soaked through with blood that pumped weakly from a chest wound that resembled a torn canvas. The twin lightning bolts of the Waffen-SS glinted dully on his collar, catching the late afternoon sun that filtered through the smoke of burning vehicles. Doc's platoon had found them 20 minutes earlier. 7 Germans, 3 already dead, the rest in various states of coming apart. The Americans had been moving fast, chasing the retreating Wehrmacht through hedgerow country that turned every field into a fortress and every farm into a tomb. They'd passed through a village that morning. Doc couldn't remember its name. They all blurred together now, where they'd found what was left of a reconnaissance patrol. 12 Americans, hands bound with wire, shot in the back of the head, and left in a barn. Someone had carved SS runes into the wooden door. Leave him. The voice belonged to Private Eddie Kowalski, a squat kid from Pittsburgh whose brother had died at Kasserine Pass. He's not worth a bandage, Doc. Not worth the air he's breathing. The German boy's eyes flickered open. They were blue, almost colorless in their paleness. And in them, Doc saw something that made his hands pause for just a fraction of a second. Absolute terror mixed with resignation. The boy's lips moved, forming words in German that Doc didn't need to translate. Let me die. Just let me die. Doc looked at his helmet, at the red cross painted on white canvas, brilliant and stark against the olive drab. He thought about the other cross, the iron one they'd found on some of the executed Americans, pressed into their palms by whoever had killed them. A mockery of mercy. He thought about the oath he'd sworn, the one that didn't have exceptions for enemy uniforms or political beliefs or the unspeakable things that symbol on the boy's collar represented. I wear a red cross, Doc said quietly, pulling his aid kit from his pack. Not a black eagle, not a judgment, a red cross. The morphine went in first. A quarter grain jabbed into the boy's thigh through the torn trousers. Doc's fingers worked with the mechanical precision born of too many shattered bodies. Too many boys bleeding out in ditches just like this one. The chest wound was catastrophic. A shell fragment had punched through ribs and probably nicked a lung. Air bubbled through blood with each shallow breath. Without immediate intervention, the boy had maybe 20 minutes. With intervention, maybe 21. You can't be serious. Sergeant Mike Torres stood over them, his Thompson hanging loose in his grip. Torres had been the one to find the barn that morning, had been the one to cut the wire from dead men's wrists. That kid probably pulled the trigger on some of our guys, probably laughed while he did it. Doc didn't answer. He was cutting through the uniform now, exposing pale skin that had probably never seen combat until a few weeks ago. Skin that was already turning bluish around the wound. He could hear the distinctive sound of a tension pneumothorax developing, the wheeze and whistle of air escaping into the chest cavity where it had no business being. In a field hospital, this would take a chest tube and proper sterile technique. Here, in a ditch on a road whose name he didn't know, it would take a knife, a rubber tube from an IV set, and the kind of desperate improvisation they didn't teach in medical school. Hold him, Doc said to no one in particular. Kowalski, still muttering curses, grabbed the boy's shoulders. The German's eyes widened as Doc pulled out his aid knife, but the morphine was already dulling the edges of panic. This is going to hurt. I'm sorry. The incision went in between the 4th and 5th ribs, guided more by feel than sight. Blood welled up, but not arterial, not the kind that meant death in seconds. Doc's fingers found the space, inserted the rubber tube, and the immediate hiss of escaping air told him he'd been right. The boy gasped, a sound that was half relief and half agony, and his color immediately began to improve from dusky blue to merely pale. Doc worked in silence, packing the wound, securing the improvised drain, wrapping pressure bandages with hands that had stopped shaking years ago. Around him, his platoon watched with expressions ranging from disgust to grudging respect to something harder to name. They'd all seen Doc work before, had all watched him perform minor miracles in conditions that would make most surgeons weep. But this was different. This was the enemy. This was SS. "Radio for evacuation," Doc said, sitting back on his heels. His hands were red to the wrists. "He needs surgery. Real surgery. Hospital." "You're out of your mind," Kowalski said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "They're going to ask questions, Doc. They're going to ask why you wasted supplies on SS. Then they can ask." Doc pulled out a cigarette, realized his hands were too bloody to light it, and stuck it behind his ear instead. "I didn't take an oath to treat only the people I like. I took an oath to treat the people who need it." The boy was conscious now, the morphine and the sudden ability to breathe properly bringing him back from the edge. His pale eyes fixed on Doc's face, and in them was an expression of such complete bewilderment that it almost looked like betrayal. He said something in German, urgent and confused, and one of the other wounded Germans, a corporal with a shattered leg, translated in broken English. He asks, "Why? Why you save him?" He says, "He is SS. He says you should leave him to die. This is what he was told you would do." Doc looked at the boy, at the face that could have belonged to any farm kid from Iowa or Nebraska, at the uniform that marked him as part of the most feared and hated military organization in Europe, at the wound that would have killed him in minutes without intervention. He thought about all the things he could say, all the moral complexity and ethical nuance, all the reasons and justifications and explanations. "Tell him," Doc said finally, "that he was lied to." The evacuation came 30 minutes later, a pair of medics with a stretcher, and barely concealed hostility when they saw the SS insignia. But they took him anyway, because that's what the system demanded, and because even in war, there are rules that some men follow even when it would be easier not to. Doc watched them carry the boy away, watched the pale face disappear into the back of an ambulance that would take him first to a field hospital, then to an evacuation hospital, then eventually to a POW camp somewhere far from the hedgerows and the smoke and the killing. He didn't think about him again for months. There were too many other wounded, too many other boys bleeding in too many other ditches. The war moved forward, through France and into Belgium and finally into Germany itself, and Doc Rasmussen moved with it, his aid kit always within reach, his hands always ready to work their small miracles of battlefield medicine. The war ended. Doc came home to Minnesota, to a wife who barely recognized the man who'd left 3 years earlier, to a job at the Veterans Hospital in Minneapolis, to nightmares that woke him in the middle of the night with the smell of cordite still in his nostrils. He didn't talk about what he'd seen, didn't tell stories at the VFW hall, didn't march in parades. He went to work, came home, tried to remember how to be a person instead of a pair of hands that kept other people alive. The letter arrived in the spring of 1949, forwarded through so many military channels that the envelope was barely holding together. It was written in careful, stilted English, the handwriting precise and slightly Germanic in its angularity. "Dear Dr. Rasmussen, I do not know if you remember me. My name is Klaus Becker. In the summer of 1944, you saved my life on a road near St. Lo. I was Waffen-SS, wounded in the chest. You operated on me in a ditch, though your comrades told you to leave me to die. I was 19 years old. I am writing to you now because I am 24, and I would not be 24 if not for you." Doc read the letter 3 times before he could make sense of it. The boy. The SS kid with the chest wound. He'd survived. Of course he'd survived. Doc's makeshift chest tube had bought him the time he needed to get to real surgeons, real hospitals, real medicine. But Doc had never expected to hear about it. Never expected the story to continue beyond that moment in the ditch. I want you to understand what you did that day, though I think perhaps you already understand better than I do. I was raised in the Hitler Youth. I was taught from the age of 10 that America was degenerate, that you were a mongrel nation of weaklings and criminals and racial inferiors who would collapse the moment we attacked with true German strength and discipline. I was taught that American soldiers were cowards who would surrender at the first sign of resistance, that they would torture and execute prisoners, that they had no honor or humanity or dignity. You saved my life anyway. After I recovered, I was sent to a POW camp in Illinois. Camp Ellis, they called it. I worked in a factory there, assembling agricultural machinery. I worked beside black men and white men, and they received the same rations, and they stood at the same machines, and they spoke to each other as equals. I worked beside men whose parents came from Italy and Poland and Ireland and Germany, all of them American, all of them treated with the same basic dignity. The guards did not beat us. The food was plain, but sufficient. We were paid, not much, but paid for our work. I want you to understand that every single thing I had been taught about America was revealed to be a lie. Not a small lie, not an exaggeration, but a complete and absolute inversion of reality. The degenerate mongrels treated us with more humanity than my own officers had treated their own men. The weak cowards had defeated the strongest military machine Europe had ever seen. The criminals and inferiors had built a society where a man could work and eat and live with dignity, regardless of where his parents were born. And it began with you, in that ditch, when you looked at my uniform and decided that the red cross on your helmet meant something more important than the black eagle on mine. Doc set the letter down and stared at his hands. They were older now, marked with scars and calluses and the slight tremor that came from too many years of high-stakes medicine. They were the same hands that had cut into Klaus Becker's chest on a muddy road in France, the same hands that had held pressure on wounds and inserted tubes and wrapped bandages around boys who were dying and boys who were going to live and boys who fell somewhere in between. The letter continued. I am home now in Germany. I work as a machinist in a factory in Stuttgart. I am engaged to be married. I have a future because you gave me a present when I had resigned myself to having neither. But more than that, you gave me something I did not know I needed. You destroyed the mythology that had poisoned my mind since childhood. You did it not with words or arguments or propaganda, but with action. You saved the life of a man who represented everything you had reason to hate. And in doing so, you proved that everything I believed was false. I do not know if you are a religious man, Dr. Rasmussen. I am not, or at least I was not. But I think what you did that day was the closest thing to grace I have ever witnessed. You saw me, not as SS, not as enemy, not as the boy who might have killed your friends, but as a human being who was dying. And you refused to let me die, even though it would have been easier, even though it would have been justified, even though no one would have blamed you. I am writing to thank you, but also to tell you something I think you should know. You did not just save one life that day. You saved every life I might touch going forward. You saved the family I will raise, the friends I will keep, the work I will do. You saved the version of me that is not SS, that is not Nazi, that is not the boy who was taught to hate. You saved the version of me that can look at a black American or a Jewish refugee or a Polish laborer and see a human being, not a category, not a threat, not an inferior. Your cross was red, mine was iron. You chose yours. I did not choose mine, but you gave me the chance to choose what comes after. With profound gratitude and respect, Klaus Becker Doc read the letter a fourth time, then a fifth. He thought about that day in the ditch, about the decision that hadn't felt like a decision at all, just a reflex born of training and oath, and something deeper than either. He thought about Kowalski's voice, bitter and angry. "He's not worth a bandage, Doc." He thought about his own response, the words that had come without planning. "I wear a red cross, not a black eagle." He hadn't thought he was making a philosophical statement. He'd just been doing his job, following the oath he'd sworn, treating the patient in front of him without regard for uniform or politics or the terrible weight of history that uniform carried. But Klaus Becker had interpreted it as grace, as a deliberate choice to see humanity where ideology demanded he see only enemy. And maybe, Doc thought, maybe that interpretation was more accurate than his own memory of simple medical necessity. He thought about the POW camp in Illinois, about Klaus standing beside black workers and white workers, and slowly realizing that everything he'd been taught was a lie. He thought about the accumulation of small moments that must have led to that realization. The first shared lunch, the first conversation, the first time an American guard treated him with basic decency when he'd been trained to expect brutality. He thought about how difficult it must have been to dismantle a worldview, built over a decade of intensive propaganda, to admit that you'd been catastrophically wrong about the fundamental nature of reality. And he thought about all the other boys he'd treated in ditches and fields and shattered buildings. All the American boys and British boys and German boys and Italian boys, all of them bleeding the same red blood, all of them crying for their mothers in the same terrified voices. All of them fundamentally identical in the moment of their dying. He'd known this, of course. Every medic knew it. But knowing it and being thanked for it were different things. Doc folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer, in the back, where his wife wouldn't find it, and ask questions he didn't know how to answer. He went to work that day, came home, ate dinner, went to bed. But something had shifted. Some weight he'd been carrying without realizing it had gotten infinitesimally lighter. In the decades that followed, Klaus Becker built the life he'd promised in his letter. He married his fiancée, a schoolteacher named Margaret, who had lost her own father in the war. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and Klaus made sure they understood the war not as mythology or glory, but as human catastrophe, born of human choices. He worked his way up from machinist to foreman to manager, eventually running the small factory where he'd started. He never joined a political party again, never marched in demonstrations, never allowed ideology to supersede his judgment of individual human beings. He told his children about Doc Rasmussen, not often, and never as a lecture but as a story when they asked about the scar on his chest, about the war, about why he insisted they treat everyone with basic dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. He told them about lying in a ditch, bleeding to death, convinced that American soldiers would leave him to die, because that's what he'd been taught they would do. He told them about the moment Doc had pulled out his aid kit and said, "I wear a red cross," and how that single sentence had begun the slow, painful process of dismantling a decade of lies. Doc Rasmussen never wrote back. He thought about it, drafted responses in his head during slow shifts at the hospital, but he never found words that felt adequate to the weight of what Klaus was describing. What could he say? "You're welcome for saving your life. I'm glad you're not a Nazi anymore." The whole thing felt too large for language, too complex for the simple exchange of letters. So he kept Klaus's letter in his desk drawer, took it out occasionally to read when the nightmares got bad, and went on with his life. He never told anyone about the letter. Not his wife, not his children, not the other veterans he knew from the hospital. It felt private somehow, like a secret that belonged to just 2 people. The medic who'd refused to let a boy die, and the boy who'd lived to become something his uniform had never predicted he could be. Doc died in 1978 of a heart attack at the age of 63. Probably brought on by 3 packs of cigarettes a day and the kind of stress that never quite leaves a man who spent 3 years treating battlefield casualties. His wife found the letter when she was sorting through his desk, read it with tears running down her face, and carefully placed it in the box with his other war mementos, his medals, his discharge papers, his photographs of men whose names she'd never heard him speak. Klaus died in 2006 at 81, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who knew him as a kind man, a fair man, a man who insisted on treating everyone with dignity, and who had somehow emerged from the most hateful ideology of the 20th century, with his humanity intact. At his funeral, his eldest son told the story of the American medic in the ditch, the story Klaus had told them all, the story that had become family mythology. He told it not as a war story, but as a parable about grace, about the moment when one man's simple refusal to let another man die had broken the machinery of indoctrination and hate. Neither man ever met again after that day in the ditch. Neither man knew the full story of what the other had become, the lives they'd lived, the choices they'd made in the decades after the war ended. Doc never knew about Klaus's children, never knew about the factory he'd managed, never knew about the small acts of kindness Klaus performed, because a medic had once shown him that humanity was stronger than ideology. Klaus never knew that Doc carried his letter for 29 years, never knew that he'd read it during bad nights when the nightmares came, never knew that his words about grace and humanity and the Red Cross had given Doc a language for something he'd done instinctively, but never fully understood. What they shared was simpler and more profound than knowledge. They shared the moment in the ditch, the moment when one man's oath and training and fundamental decency had collided with another man's indoctrination and terror and absolute certainty of death. They shared the moment when Doc had said, "I wear a red cross," and Klaus had begun to understand that everything he'd been taught was a lie. They shared the moment when an American medic had treated a Waffen-SS soldier as a human being who deserved to live, and in doing so had proven that humanity was stronger than any symbol, any uniform, any ideology. The road near St. Lo is still there, paved now, lined with modern houses and tidy farms. Tour groups sometimes stop there, part of the circuit of D-Day beaches and battlefield memorials that bring hundreds of thousands of visitors to Normandy each year. The guides tell stories of the fighting, of the hedgerows that turned fields into fortresses, of the terrible casualties both sides suffered in the summer of 1944. None of them mention the ditch where Doc Rasmussen saved Klaus Becker's life. Why would they? It was one moment among millions, one wounded soldier among hundreds of thousands, one medic among tens of thousands who performed similar acts of desperate medicine in similar desperate circumstances. The war was too large for individual stories, too vast for single moments of grace or mercy or simple human decency. But Klaus Becker remembered, and Doc Rasmussen remembered. And in that remembering, in that shared knowledge of a moment when ideology shattered against reality, lies something that the grand narratives of war often miss. The individual choices that determine whether we remain human or become something less. The decision to see a person rather than a symbol. The refusal to let suffering go unrelieved simply because the person suffering wore the wrong uniform. The quiet, undramatic insistence that some obligations, to oath, to profession, to basic humanity, supersede all others. Doc Rasmussen wore a red cross, not a black eagle, not a judgment, not a political statement. A red cross which meant that everyone who bled deserved treatment, that everyone who was dying deserved an attempt to save them, that the categories we create to separate ourselves from each other matter less than the fundamental fact of our shared humanity. He never thought he was making a statement. He was just doing his job. But Klaus Becker understood that sometimes doing your job is the most radical act possible. Sometimes refusing to see the uniform is the only way to see the person. Sometimes grace looks like a morphine injection and an improvised chest tube in a muddy ditch, performed by a man with blood on his hands and a cross on his helmet, who simply refuses to let another human being die when he has the skill and the tools to prevent it. The war ended 79 years ago. Doc Rasmussen has been dead for 46 years. Klaus Becker has been dead for 18. But the moment they shared, the moment when one man saved another, and in doing so destroyed the mythology that had poisoned a generation, that moment remains. Preserved in a letter that sits now in a military museum in Minnesota, a testament to the idea that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy have the largest consequences. Sometimes a red cross is stronger than a black eagle. Sometimes humanity defeats ideology. Sometimes a man in a ditch with a sucking chest wound gets to live long enough to understand that everything he believed was a lie, and that the truth is better, stranger, and more hopeful than he ever imagined possible. Sometimes grace looks like this: dirty hands, improvised tools, and a simple refusal to let hate determine who deserves to live and who deserves to die. That's all. That's everything.